The Alpha King sentenced me to die at dawn, and I did not weep. I have thought about that a great deal in the time since. Whether it was courage, or shock, or the kind of stubbornness my mother used to call my worst inheritance. The part of her that refused to give a man with a sword the satisfaction of seeing her afraid. I think it was none of those. I think it was that when Halvar Erik of the North Reach pronounced the words from his wolf throne, I was already busy watching his 3-year-old daughter, who had been standing at the foot of the dais with her hand in her nurse's hand, and who had been looking at me across the length of the great hall for the entire trial. She was looking at me the way a wolf looks at something it has decided. She was 3 years old. I did not yet know what her looking meant. I knew only that no one else in that hall had looked at me like that. Not the council, who had read their parchments with the careful disinterest of men who had already chosen their verdict. Not the warriors at the long tables, who had watched me the way warriors watch any condemned woman, which is to say, briefly. Not the Alpha King himself, who had not looked at me at all. His eyes had been on the warrant in Lord Cassian Vroth's hand the entire time. His mouth had been a hard line. His shoulders had been set as if the chamber were colder than it was. He had said the words, "Dawn, the block, by pack law." He had not signed anything in front of the court. I noticed that. I have a small, unfortunate gift for noticing things that no one is asking me to notice. The wrong word in a witness's deposition, the way the High Steward's signet was on the wrong hand the morning he questioned me, the date written at the top of the warrant Lord Vroth had presented to the throne, which was 3 days older than the warrant had any right to be. I noticed these things, and I did not say them, because I was 23 years old, and I had been an apprentice in the King's archive for 2 summers, and I had learned that women apprentices who noticed things in the archive of the North Reach did not, by and large, become senior archivists. They became sentenced to die at dawn for the poisoning of the King's sister-by-pact, which is the kind of charge that does not happen by accident. So I noticed, and I did not speak, and the King did not look at me, and the King's daughter, Tove of the North Reach, 3 years old, in a small green wool dress that did not quite match her boots, did not stop looking. The warriors took me down to the cells. I want to be clear that the cells of the North Reach are not what the songs make them. They are not pits. They are stone rooms in the foundation of the fortress, dry, cold, with iron bars across one wall and a slot in the door for food. There is straw on the floor. There is a wooden bucket. There is a small high window with a grate over it that looks out at the level of the courtyard cobbles, so that if you are lucky, you can see boots passing and know what time it is by which boots pass. I sat down against the back wall. I waited for myself to weep. I did not. I sat with my back against the stones, and I thought about the warrant in Vroth's hand, the date, the seal, the King's signature, which I had catalogued in the archive for 2 years, and which I could draw from memory, and which had not, in any particular I could see from the dais, been the King's hand. I thought about the King's sister-by-pact, who had died of poison in early spring, and who I had brought tea to twice in her last month, because the archive was on the way, and she had liked the taste of mountain mint. I thought about the cup in the kitchen that the cook had told me to take up, and which had been waiting for me already steeped. I thought, in the cold stone room under the fortress, I was set up by someone who knew which apprentice would not say no to a cup. I was still thinking it when I heard the small footsteps in the corridor outside. It was past midnight by the boots in the high window. I had counted 3 changes of the watch. The footsteps were not a watchman's. They were small and uneven, and they were padding on the stone the way a child pads who has been told not to run in corridors and is testing the rule with great seriousness. They came down the corridor and they stopped outside my door, and a small voice said, with the dignified clarity of a person who has been practicing in her head, "Are you the lady?" I did not answer immediately. I sat very still against the stones, and I looked toward the bars of my cell, and I saw, in the dim light of the corridor torch, a small girl in a green wool dress and mismatched boots, holding a carved wooden wolf in her left hand. "I am a lady," I said, carefully. "I do not know if I am the lady." She considered this. She had her father's eyes, which is the kind of detail you note when you are about to die. She had the wide, serious mouth of a child who had not yet been told that her father was a king. She had her hand wrapped tightly around the wolf, which was about the size of her palm, dark wood, carved with a precision that did not match a peasant's whittling. "My wolf says you are," she said. She crouched down. The cell bars went to the floor, but at the bottom there was a gap of perhaps a hand's width where the iron had worn the stone. The cells of the north reach were old, and the foundation had settled. And she set the wooden wolf down on the corridor side and pushed it through the gap toward me. Then, before I could speak, before I could think, before I could call for the watchman, or call for her nurse, or call for any of the 7 people who ought by every law of the pack to have been with this child instead of me, she lay down flat on her stomach, and she crawled. She crawled under the bars of my cell. She fit easily. She was 3. The gap that had been carved by decades of damp and neglect was barely wide enough for the king's daughter to scrape her shoulder through, and she did it without ceremony, and she stood up on the straw on my side of the bars, and she looked at me with very great seriousness, and she said, "You are cold." "I am," I said. "Mama was cold," she said. "Before." She climbed into my lap. I did not know what to do with my hands. I will say that again, because it is the truest sentence I can offer about the moment my life changed. I did not know what to do with my hands. I had spent 2 years in the King's archive learning where to put my hands so that no senior archivist would have cause to comment. I had spent the trial keeping my hands flat against my apron so that no warrior would mistake any gesture for protest. I had spent every minute since the warrant was read keeping my hands very, very still. And now there was a 3-year-old in my lap with the king's eyes, and her wolf had decided I was the lady, and she was cold, and she was waiting, with the patience of something that has known me for longer than I have been alive, for me to figure out where to put my hands. I put one on her back. I put the other on the wooden wolf she had pushed through to me, which was sitting on the straw between us. The wolf was warm. It had been in her hand all night, was the only sensible reason, but I will tell you something I have never told anyone, except her father, much later. It felt warm, the way a thing feels warm that has been held by a person who loves it. It felt warm, the way the cup of tea I had brought up to the king's sister-by-pact had felt warm, before I had known what was in it. It felt warm, the way a hearth feels in a room you did not realize was cold. Tove of the North Reach put her head against my collarbone, and she said into the wool of my dress, with the absolute matter-of-fact certainty of a child who is informing you of the weather, "My papa is going to be very surprised." It was at that moment that I heard the running boots in the corridor. Several pairs. Heavy. Not a watchman's pace. The pace of warriors who had discovered that the king's only daughter was not in the royal wing and had been searching the fortress. And underneath those boots, closer, faster, one pair alone that I knew without ever having heard them. The Alpha King of the North Reach came around the corner of the corridor at a dead run, and he stopped at the bars of my cell, and he saw me sitting on the straw with his daughter in my lap and her wooden wolf in my hand, and the look on his face was not a king's look. It was the look of a man who had just understood that his wolf had known something for the entire trial that he had refused to let himself know. He did not speak. He looked at his daughter. He looked at his daughter's hand wrapped around the front of my dress. He looked at the wooden wolf in my hand. He looked at my face. He said, very quietly, in a voice that was not the voice he had used from the wolf throne, "How did she get in?" "Under the bars," I said. I did not say "my lord." I did not say anything else. There was a 3-year-old asleep against my chest, and the King of the North Reach was standing on the other side of iron bars he had ordered me to die behind at dawn. And I had spent the last hour learning that someone in his court had forged his signature, and I was not going to call him my lord until I had decided what I thought. He looked at me for a long moment. He looked at me the way the warrior at the corner of the long table had not looked at me during the trial. He looked at me the way Tove had been looking at me. He looked at me with the slow, dawning, terrible attention of a wolf who has just realized that the woman he sentenced to die at dawn is the woman whose voice his daughter's wolf has been quieting on for the last 6 months without him understanding why. He said, "Tove." The child did not answer. She was already asleep. He said, "Tove, come to your papa." "She is asleep, my lord." I said it without thinking. My lord. The word arrived in my mouth before my mind caught up, and I heard it land in him. The small flinch at the temple, the breath taken and not used, and I understood, with a small and inconvenient flash of clarity, that this man had been called my lord by a great many people that day, and that mine had been the only one he had heard. He went down on one knee in the corridor. He brought his face level with the bars. He looked at his daughter in the lap of the woman he had sentenced to die at dawn. He looked at the wolf in my hand. "That is the wolf I carved for her," he said. "She does not let anyone hold it." I will tell you what stopped me, in case you are still here, in case you have stayed with me this far, which I am grateful for. I am still working out, as I tell you this, what to say to a man who has carved a wooden wolf for his daughter at the end of long council nights, and what to say to the child who put that wolf in my hand at midnight in a cell, and what to do with the small, terrifying fact that her wolf knew me before I knew myself. If you have ever had to decide whether to forgive a man for a thing he was about to do, and then discovered, halfway through deciding, that he had been about to refuse to do it, tell me in the comments. I am trying to understand what I felt. Stay with me. The rest of the night gets stranger. I let him take her. I did not let him take her at first. He reached through the bars for her, very carefully, the way a man reaches for something he is afraid of breaking, and I held her tighter without meaning to, and he froze, with his hand at the bars, and he said, in the voice of a man who had not begged for anything in a great many years, "Please." The wooden wolf was still in my hand. I unwrapped Tove's arms from the front of my dress, gently, and I passed her to him through the bars in the way you pass a thing precious between two people who do not yet trust each other, but who are agreed for one moment on what matters. He took her into the curve of his arms, the way a father takes a child who has been missing for an hour and who has been found in the worst possible room. And he closed his eyes. He held her for a long time. Then he opened his eyes, and he looked at me through the bars, and he said, "Why did you bring tea to my sister twice?" The question landed in my chest like a stone. It was the right question. It was the only question. The trial had spent 4 hours establishing that I had brought her 1 cup. The trial had not asked about the cup before, the one I had brought a fortnight earlier on a different errand with mountain mint she had asked for by name. The fact that he was asking told me he had read every page of the testimony with the eye of a man who had been listening for the thing the testimony was not saying. "Because she liked the taste," I said. "Because she asked for it. Because the kitchen was on the way, and the cook gave it to me already brewed both times." "The cook is dead." "I know, my lord." He looked at me. I had said my lord again, and we had both heard it, and he had not flinched this time. "The warrant was 3 days old," he said. He did not say it as a question. "Yes, my lord." "You saw the date." "From the dais. The seal was not in your hand." He closed his eyes again. He held Tove. He said very quietly into the corridor, into the stone, into the cold, "I have been writing the warrant for 3 days. I have not signed it. Lord Vroth presented a warrant to the throne this morning that I did not finish writing." I had known. I had known from the date and the seal and the way the king had not looked at me. But knowing a thing for myself is different from being told it by the man whose name would have killed me at dawn. And something in my chest that had been holding very still for the last 12 hours decided that it could, in fact, sit down. I did not weep. I did, however, lean my head back against the cold stones of the cell wall, and I closed my eyes, and I said, "Halvar." I had not meant to say his name. I had meant to say something else, anything else. The name had been in my mouth from the moment his daughter put the wolf in my hand, and now there was no putting it back. I heard it leave me, and I heard it land in him, and I knew, in the silence that followed, that I had crossed a line a junior archivist of the North Reach did not cross with her king, under any circumstances, ever. And I knew, in the same silence, that his wolf had already crossed that line for him several hours ago, in front of his entire court, when his daughter had stood at the foot of the dais and would not stop looking at me. He said my name. He said it the way Tove had said, "Mama." Wren. He had read my name from a file. He had read it in his daughter's voice at the dinner table for 6 months, because Tove had been listening to me read aloud in the archive courtyard on the afternoons her nurse brought her down, and Tove had been going home and reciting half-remembered fragments of seal law to her father at supper. I had not known this until later. I did not know it in the cell. I knew only that he said my name as if he had been practicing it. It was then that we heard the other footsteps. The assassin was already in the corridor. I do not think Lord Wroth had meant for it to be the king's daughter who interrupted him. I do not think Lord Wroth had been told by his informants in the royal wing that the king's daughter had slipped her nurse 3 hours ago. I think Lord Wroth had assumed that a junior archivist in a stone cell with no witnesses would be a matter of perhaps a quarter hour with a quiet knife and the right story in the morning. She despaired. She did it herself. The sentence was carried out by her own hand. I think Lord Wroth had assumed his king would be in the royal wing with his daughter, because the king had every other midnight of his life been in the royal wing with his daughter, because the king did not, by reputation, walk down to the cells. I think Lord Wroth had assumed a great many things. The assassin came around the corner of the corridor with a thin blade in his offhand and the soft step of a man who knew the fortress, and he stopped, very abruptly, at the sight of his king kneeling in the corridor with the king's daughter in his arms. There was a pause. I have thought about that pause a great deal. The assassin's pause is the pause of a man whose entire plan has just dissolved in front of him, and who is trying, in the space of half a breath, to decide whether to back down the corridor or to commit. He committed. It was the wrong choice. He took 1 step forward, and he raised the blade, and he opened his mouth. I suspect to say something practiced, the kind of sentence assassins must rehearse for the times their work is witnessed. And Halvar Erik did not stand up. He stayed on one knee in the corridor, with his daughter cradled in his arms. He simply turned his head. His wolf came forward in him in a way I have never seen a wolf come forward. Not a shift, not a full one, but enough of one that the assassin's blade hand stopped moving in mid-air, and the corridor torch guttered, and the assassin understood, in the way a man understands when he has miscalculated very badly, that he was not going to leave this corridor on his feet. The warriors who had been running the corridor reached us a heartbeat later. They took him. He did not resist. He had nowhere to be resisted to. Halvar Erik stood up with his daughter in his arms, and he looked at the warriors, and he said, in a voice that was now the voice from the wolf throne, the voice I had heard pronounce sentence on me 11 hours earlier. "Bring Lord Wroth to the council chamber. Wake the High Witch. Wake every member of council. The warrant presented this morning was not in my hand, and the woman in this cell is not to be touched. Bring her up. Bring her food. Bring her a cloak. Bring me a key." The senior warrior said, "My lord, the council will object." "The council," said Halvar Erik, "will witness." The warrior went. The other warriors went with him. Halvar Erik stood in the corridor with his daughter asleep against his shoulder, and he looked at me through the bars of my cell, and he said, very quietly, in a voice that had nothing of the wolf throne in it, "I will get you out. I will get the door open, And then I am going to do something in front of my council that no Alpha King of the North Reach has ever done. And I am asking. I am not requiring. I am asking you to stand beside me when I do it, because they will need to see that you chose it. They will not believe the warrant was forged unless they see you choose to stand with the man who would have killed you. I cannot ask that of you. I am asking it. I looked at him. I looked at his daughter against his shoulder. I looked at the wooden wolf, which I was still holding. "My lord," I said, "you have not yet apologized." He looked at me. The corner of his mouth did something that, in a man who had spent 2 years being the most controlled face in the North Reach, could only be described as a flicker. "No," he said, "I have not." "I am going to want one, in front of your council." "You will have it." "And the wolf stays with me until you sign the pardon." He looked at the wooden wolf in my hand, his daughter's wolf, the wolf he had carved at the end of long council nights and given to a child who had spent 6 months listening for my voice in the archive courtyard without his knowing. "It stays with you," he said. The council chamber at the second bell after midnight was very full and very awake and very afraid, and I will not give you the long version of what happened there, because I do not, even now, remember all of it. I remember the High Witch unrolling the warrant and laying it next to a parchment in Halvar's own hand, and saying, in the tone of a woman who has been waiting all her life for one good public confrontation, that the seal had been lifted from a half-finished draft and pressed to a forged signature with such craft that only a junior archivist with a peculiar gift for noticing the wrong things would have caught it. I remember Lord Cassian Vroth saying nothing, because there was nothing to say. I remember the chair he was bound to being carried out of the chamber by his own former allies. I remember the council voting, one, by show of hand, to strip him of name, lands, seal, and the right to be spoken of in the North Reach ever again. I remember Halvar Erik standing at the head of the council table with his daughter still in his arms. She would not be put down, she had decided, the entire night that she would not be put down, and saying, into the silence of that chamber, that he had sentenced an innocent woman to die on the strength of a forgery he had failed to question because he had been tired and grieving and had wanted the matter of his sister's death to be ended, and that this was a failure of judgment in an Alpha King that Pack law did not permit him to wave off, and that he was, in the presence of the High Witch and his full council, formally asking the woman in question for her forgiveness. He said it, looking at me. I will tell you what I said. I said, "Look at me when I forgive you, my lord." He had been looking at the floor. He looked up. His eyes were not the wolf throne's eyes. They were Tove's, exactly. Which is to say, wide and gold and tired and afraid of being told no. I said, in front of his full council and his High Witch, and his daughter, and his wolf, "I forgive you." I did not say it kindly. I said it the way an archivist signs a corrected entry. Clean, definite, on the record. The council heard it. The High Witch heard it. Lord Vroth's empty chair heard it. Halvar Erik did the thing he had not done from the wolf throne. He came down off the dais of the council chamber, and he crossed the floor, and he stopped 1 pace from me, and he set his daughter down. She allowed it, finally, because she had been awake for the last quarter of an hour, and was watching us with great interest. And he took my hand, and he turned it over, and he placed his forehead against the inside of my wrist. That was the kiss. That was all of it. The press of his forehead to the pulse of my wrist, in front of his council, which was the most a king of the North Reach was permitted, by the law of the pack, to do to a woman to whom he had not yet been bonded. What broke open inside me had nothing to do with his mouth or his skin. It had to do with the fact that the man who had sentenced me to die at dawn had, 11 hours later, knelt in his own council chamber and asked a junior archivist to keep his daughter's wooden wolf until the pardon was signed. The pardon was signed. Tove watched him sign it. She stood on the chair he had pulled out for her, and she watched the quill move, and she said, with the same matter-of-fact certainty she had used in the cell, "Now Mama can stay." The council heard it. Halvar did not correct her. He looked at me over the top of his daughter's head, and he said, very quietly, only to me, "Ren, I will not require this, but I will not pretend I am not asking." I looked at Tove. I looked at the wooden wolf, which was still in my hand, and which I had been holding now for 3 hours, and which I had no intention, ever, of giving back. "I will stay," I said. 6 months later, on the morning the bonding ceremony was held in the great hall, Tove walked the length of the chamber on her own 2 feet, in a green wool dress that did not quite match her boots, and she carried the wooden wolf in her left hand, and at the dais she handed it up to me, not to her father, to me, and she said, in front of the assembled court, the sentence she had been practicing all week with the seriousness of a child preparing for her first formal duty. "You are the lady, my wolf says." The court laughed. Some of the older warriors wept. The High Witch, who had bound Halvar and me with the silver cord a moment earlier, put her hand briefly on the top of Tove's head and said, "And so it has been recorded. The wolf sits on the window-sill of our chambers now. Tove visits it. She tells it things. She tells it about the council she will one day sit on, and about the wing of the archive that was rebuilt and put under my hand, and about her father, whom she still calls my papa, and who still, when she asks, carves small wooden things at the end of long council nights. A fox, a hare, a small running boy with no face yet because he has not been born, though we have hopes. Halvar does not sentence people from the wolf throne any more without consulting his archivist. His archivist has, on more than one occasion, sent the council home until morning, on the grounds that the king has not yet slept, and the matter under discussion involves a seal she would like to examine in daylight. The council has stopped objecting. The council has, in fact, taken to addressing requests for difficult cases to her by name, in the same tone in which they once addressed them to the king. "Luna Wren, would you read this for us? Would you tell us what it does not say?" I read. I tell them what it does not say. "Tell me then, did you see it, when Tove crawled under the bars? Did you know what the wolf meant? Did you guess about the warrant before Halvar said it aloud? Where are you listening from tonight, and what was the moment you decided to stay with me? I want to know. I am still working out which of those moments was the one that turned the story, and the comments are how I learn. If her side of the story is the one you came here for, subscribe so the next one finds you. I will be here. I have a chair at the council table now, and I do not plan on getting up.